To understand what happened to Frank Jordano, you have to understand why his family was vulnerable in the first place. It's New Orleans, 1919. By this year, over 8,000 Italian immigrants, many from the island of Sicily, had made New Orleans home. Some estimates put that number closer to 25,000 if you count the children born here. Most came for one reason: to escape. Back in Sicily, there was nothing. Dusty villages, unpayable taxes, bandits who controlled the roads. Working in someone else's field for your entire life, never able to get ahead. So they came to Louisiana. Not New Orleans itself, but to the sugarcane fields. Brutal work, hot, and dangerous. But it paid. And if you were smart, if you saved every penny, you could get out of those fields. The escape route? Become a grocer. Italian groceries became the entry point to the American dream for these immigrants. You'd work the cane fields for 10 years, save $5,000, and suddenly you can open a small store. Control your own hours, own your own future. Orlando Gordilardio did exactly that. In 1873, at just 21 years old, he left Campferitio, a dusty Sicilian town in the western mountains. He arrived in New Orleans with nothing. Illiterate, unskilled, only equipped with a full dashing mustache and determination. He worked the cane fields. He saved his money, and by 1892, he achieved his dream. He opened a grocery store. He raised a family. His son Frank was born. Frank grew up watching his father build something from nothing. By the age of 18, Frank was already an insurance agent, ambitious, working hard, and engaged to be married. He was literally the American dream in motion. Then, March 10th, 1919 happened. The Axeman had been active for about 8 years at this point. Nobody knew it yet, but Italian grocers across New Orleans were being targeted. Their doors were being cut, their axes were being used against them. Some were even killed. The community was terrified, and Rosie Cortimiglia was about to put that fear into action. Sunday morning, March 10th, 1919. It's early and still dark. The Cortimiglia family, Charles, Rosie, and their 2-year-old daughter Mary, were asleep in the small bedroom. The house was attached to their grocery store. It was a working-class neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. Frank Jordano was asleep in his family's home next door. The killer entered through the back, just as he had done before. Everyone knew the signature. He chiseled out the panel from the kitchen door, carefully, quietly. This process wasn't rushed. This was a patient, methodical attack. In stocking feet, bare feet actually, so his boots wouldn't make noise, he moved through the dark kitchen, past the grocery, toward the bedroom. What happened next would not only destroy the lives of the family, but also those who had nothing to do with the attack. Suddenly, the axe came down. Again, and again. Charles Cortimiglia woke up in the chaos. Blood was already everywhere. He couldn't see clearly. His wife was screaming, and the baby. Their baby was silent. By the time the neighbors heard the screams and ran to help, Mary Cortimiglia was already gone. Charles and Rosie were rushed to the charity hospital, bleeding and barely conscious. But here's what's crucial. Charles saw the attackers. Through his pain, through the darkness, through the injuries, he saw their faces. And at that moment, As the sun came up over Gretna, Rosie Cortimiglia was about to change everything. She looked at Frank Jordano, who came running to help just like everyone else in the neighborhood. She looked at his elderly father, Irlando, and in her grief, in her trauma, in the terror that gripped her entire community for years, she made a choice. She pointed at them. They did this out of spite over a rental property dispute. Here's what you need to understand about Rosie's accusation. The Jordano and Cortimiglia families had a dispute over some rental property. Not a violent dispute, just a neighborhood disagreement. But it was enough that Rosie hated them. More importantly, she was terrified. The Axemen had been targeting Italian grocers for years at this point. The entire community was armed, families posted guards at night, and people couldn't sleep. And now, someone had come for the Cortimiglias. Someone had attacked their home, and more tragically, took their child. I can't say I understand what they went through, but as a father, I would be destroyed. And I would just try to understand why. When you're in that state of mind, terror, grief, trauma, and you see an enemy who you already hate, it's hard not to conceive yourself that they're the ones who are responsible. Rosie believed it. At least she convinced herself she did. But the police also believed it, because she was the victim. It made sense, because blaming someone already provided justice to a community who were desperate for answers. The jury, they believed it, because Italian names were suspicious anyway, because the Jordanos were outsiders in a neighborhood dispute. By the time Charles woke up enough to tell the truth, it was already too late. Chief of Police Reynolds arrived at the Cortimiglia home that morning to a crime scene that had been contaminated by every neighbor within 2 blocks. This is crucial. The first people to arrive at a crime scene in 1919 didn't even secure the scene. They didn't photograph it, they didn't document evidence, they just walked through it. Dozens of people walked through that bedroom, trampling potential footprints, contaminating blood evidence, destroying anything that might have actually proven who the killer was. Reynolds was an experienced officer. He knew better. By the time he arrived, the scene was destroyed. Here's what he could see. The killer cut a panel from the back door. The attacker used the victim's own axe. Nothing was stolen. And the violence was excessive, way more than needed for just a robbery. This told Reynolds something crucial. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was personal rage. This was something else entirely. But here's where the investigation failed. Instead of focusing on the evidence, Reynolds focused on suspects who fit a narrative. When Rosie pointed at the Jordanos, the narrative was complete. Irlando Jordano and his 18-year-old son Frank were arrested. The case against them? Rosie Cortimiglia's testimony that they did it out of spite. That's it. Everything else, the physical evidence, the crime scene analysis, the actual behavioral pattern of the killer, was secondary to this narrative. What the police missed, what nobody examined closely enough, was this. Charles Cortimiglia woke up. He saw the attackers, and when he was lucid enough to describe them to police, his description didn't match that of Frank or Irlando Jordano. He said so, but at this point, nobody was listening anymore. The narrative was already set. Justice would be swift. Frank Jordano, at 18 years old, would face a death sentence for a crime he didn't commit. And his father? His 70-year-old father, who had spent 45 years building a life in America from nothing, would go to prison for the same crime. But there's something else nobody paid attention to. One of the most disgusting parts of the story. The Axeman kept attacking. After the Jordanos were arrested, after the police confidently declared the case was solved, the killer struck again. Joseph Romano, another grocer, was murdered on August 10th, 1919. Sarah Lawman, 19 years old, attacked through her apartment window, September 3rd, 1919. Mike Pepitone, a grocer, murdered October 27th, 1919. And then, nothing. The attack suddenly stopped. Not because Frank Jordano was in jail, not because the killer was caught. The attack stopped because the killer simply disappeared. Or more accurately, because nobody was looking for him anymore. The trial of Frank Jordano and his father Orlando was quick. In 1919, that's how justice worked in New Orleans, especially when the defendants were Italian and the victim was grieving her murdered daughter. Rosie Cortimiglia took the stand. She testified with complete certainty the Jordanos attacked her family out of spite over the rental property. She saw them do it. The jury listened. They believed her. She was the victim in their minds, and she had nothing to gain by lying. Her 2-year-old daughter was sadly gone. Then Charles Cortimiglia took the stand, and he said something that should have ended the case right then and there. He said, "I was there. I saw the attackers. It was not the Jordanos. I know my neighbors. These were different men." Charles, the actual surviving victim, the man who had been there in the darkness, who'd seen the killers, testified for the defense. He said his wife was wrong. Now here's where it gets interesting. The jury had a choice. Believe Rosie, the distraught widow whose daughter was murdered, or believe Charles, who was there and saw actually what happened. The jury, they chose Rosie. Why? This is where xenophobia becomes the villain of this story. The Jordanos were Italian. They were outsiders. They were already in a neighborhood dispute with the Cortimiglias, Italian families with Italian names who were Italian grocers in 1919 America. Suspicion already came with the territory. The jury convicted both father and the son. Orlando Jordano received a prison sentence, while Frank Jordano, at only 18 years old, was sentenced to death. He was going to hang for a crime he didn't even commit, for a crime that his own father's accuser now admits years later he didn't commit. Think about this for a moment. Frank had just graduated high school. He was an insurance agent. He was engaged to Josie Spera, a very sweet local girl he met at Mardi Gras. He had his whole life ahead of him. Instead, he spent it in prison. His childhood became a courtroom, and his future became a cell, and potentially much worse. Orlando, who spent 45 years building a life in America from nothing, was imprisoned for a crime his neighbor made up out of grief and fear. The Jordano family was destroyed. Their reputation was destroyed, the neighborhood that knew them turned against them, and their business prospects were destroyed. Their future was destroyed. And the real killer, completely free. Completely undetected, living in the same city, or maybe moved on by now. Nobody would ever know. Because the police investigation stopped. The case was considered solved because justice in 1919 New Orleans was narratively satisfying rather than actually accurate. Here's where this story becomes even more important. For over 100 years, this case was told wrong. Historians, crime writers, documentarians, they all repeated the same narrative. They focused on the Axeman, on who he was, on the mystery. And they largely ignored the Frank Jordano wrongful conviction. Why, you may ask? Because there were other suspects. There was a man named Joseph Mumphrey who was arrested in Los Angeles after shooting Mike Pepitone's widow. Mumphrey had a criminal history, and his prison timeline sort of matched when the Axeman was active. So crime writers and historians concluded that problem solved. Mumphrey was probably the killer. The case was closed. But here's what they missed. Mumphrey was an extortionist, a black-hander. His crimes were blackmail, extortion, threatening business owners. He wasn't a serial killer who attacked families in their homes. He wasn't really violent in that way until the shooting. More importantly, there was zero forensic evidence connecting him to any Axeman crime. His conviction was based on Esther Pepitone saying, "I think that might be the guy I saw," years after her husband was killed. That's it. Circumstantial timing and the assumption that if someone fits the rough profile and has a criminal history, they probably did it. Sound familiar? That's almost exactly what happened with Frank Jordano. So now we have two wrongful convictions wrapped up in one unsolved case. And the real killer of the Axeman crimes is unknown. The real victims are not just people who were attacked, but innocent people whose lives were destroyed by false accusations. And most of the American true crime history tells this story completely wrong. This is where I need to tell you something important about how crime history gets written. Most Axeman coverage is based on a book called Ready to Hang by Robert Tallant. Tallant wrote in the 50s, and according to historian Miriam Davis, who actually did real archival research, Tallant may as well have gotten his information by hanging out at New Orleans bars. Barstool storytelling, not actual historical research. But the book became that source. Crime writers cited Tallant, documentarians cited Tallant, YouTube creators cite Tallant, and the writers who even wrote most of the other books about it cite Tallant. Except, nobody actually fact-checked it. Tallant claimed that in 1911, Italian grocers named Crudi, Rossetti, and Tony Sciambria were murdered by the Axeman. This became canonical. Everyone repeated it. Except, and this is a real fact, these people didn't even exist. Their names don't appear in any city records. They were never murdered. What actually happened in 1911 was a grocer named Joseph Davy was murdered with his skull fractured and his wife cut up. But he wasn't famous. He wasn't named Crudi or Rossetti, so he was forgotten. One flawed source created 100 plus years of misinformation. In the Frank Jordano wrongful conviction, the actual human tragedy, the actual injustice, it got buried under decades of who the Axeman really was. People just mystery mongering. That is why this story matters. That is why we need to tell it right. To understand why Frank Jordano was so easy to convict, why a community so quickly believed his father and he were murderers, you need to understand what being Italian in 1919 America meant. The United States had a racism problem, obviously. That's not exactly a revelation, but what's less discussed is a specific xenophobia towards Italian immigrants, Sicilians especially. When Italian laborers started arriving in Louisiana in the 1880s, white plantation owners saw them as an experiment. They were more tractable than black workers, as one contemporary account described it, meaning they were considered easier to exploit because they were desperate. By 1900, Sicilians had become a dominant Italian immigrant group in New Orleans. But they weren't considered white in the racial taxonomy of the era. They weren't black. They weren't white in the sense of Northern European. They were Italian, swarthy, foreign, other. And that otherness became the foundation for suspicion. When crimes happened in Italian neighborhoods, Italians were suspects. When disputes happened between Italian businesses, the assumption was mafia involvement. The media of the era reflected this prejudice. Newspapers' accounts from the 1910s describe Italian immigrants with patronizing wonder. Their earrings, their facial hair, their passionate ways, and their alien traditions. It wasn't overt race science, but it was effective racism. And into this environment of suspicion, Rosie Cortimiglia's finger-pointing found fertile ground. Frank Jordano didn't even stand a chance. Not because the evidence was strong, but because he was Italian. Because his family had a neighborhood dispute with the Cortimiglias. Because xenophobia was the jury's baseline. The legal system in 1919 was stacked against him from the moment he was arrested. And his father's decades of work building a business, building a family, and building a life in America, all of that counted for nothing when his son was accused. There's another layer to the story that helps explain why the Axeman case became so famous, so legendary. In Italian-American culture in New Orleans, the Axeman case became synonymous with terror. And the reason isn't just about the murders, it's about the response. Sicilian tradition includes a celebration of St. Joseph on March 19th. Altars with bread and pastries are shared with the poor. It's a spiritual practice of faith and community. In 1919, after the Axeman later promised to spare anyone listening to jazz on March 19th, which is St. Joseph's night, the entire city responded with jazz. It became a legendary moment. The city that danced against death. The cultural moment where music and community defeated evil. But that's the sanitized version. The real version is more complex. The Axeman terrorized an entire community for 8 years. Italian families posted guards at night. Businesses changed their layouts. People couldn't sleep. The March 19 jazz response wasn't a victory. It was survival. It was a community in the face of terror. And even that response was tainted by a xenophobic justice system that was simultaneously destroying an innocent family. This is the context that gets lost when we talk about the mysterious Axeman or the romantic killer who loved jazz. The reality is, the Italian-American community was under siege, while simultaneously being scapegoated by a legal system that saw them as inherent suspects. Here's what separates the investigation from actual detective work. The police focused on Rosie Cortimiglia's narrative. If they focused on the evidence, they would have found something very different. Let's talk about what a real forensic analysis of the Axeman crimes reveals. The MO. Every attack followed the same pattern. The backdoor panel was cut out carefully and precisely. This was not a rush job. The attacker wore socks or stockings and removed boots before they even went inside the home. This shows planning, not rage. They used the victim's own axe. The killer knew or assumed an axe would be there. Nothing was stolen in the house or grocery stores. Cash registers were left full, safes untouched, and jewelry was left on nightstands. And the violence was excessive, way more than needed to subdue a sleeping victim. What does this pattern tell you? This isn't just a burglar who killed when discovered. This isn't mafia revenge, and this isn't organized crime. This is a personal rage directed at specific targets. So what's the victim profile? Well, the Axeman was reportedly targeting Italian grocers. Or did he? Here's what's weird. The mafia theory says Italian grocers were targeted because of the Black Hand's activities, with extortion and refusing to pay protection money. But nothing was stolen. So if the mafia wanted to send a message, they'd destroy the business. They'd burn it, rob it, they would make a point. Instead, every attack left the business untouched. So what if the Axeman wasn't targeting Italian grocers as a group, but specific Italian grocers he knew or had access to? What if the pattern isn't about ethnicity at all, but about opportunity and knowledge? So let's check out the timeline. The attack spanned from 1911 to 1919, but they're not consistent. There's gaps. In 1911, there were murders. Then nothing until 1918. Then another flurry. Then silence. Then more. So what caused these gaps? Was the killer in prison? Did he move away? Or did he stop for a period and then just resume? This pattern actually consists with someone who is locally embedded, who knew the community, and who might have shifted between periods of impulse control and escalation. So let's discuss the skills that are required for these type of murders. The door panel cutting was precise. It wasn't smashing through, it was careful carpentry. Cut just enough to reach the bolt. So this isn't just a random violent act. The attacker moved through the homes without waking people until he reached their bedrooms. This shows familiarity with the home's layouts, or at least the ability to move silently and carefully. So, what about the absence of criminality? Here's what's most telling. The killer never acted like a burglar. He never went back, he never demanded ransom, he never left messages except for one letter which might be a newspaper fabrication, which is maybe not from the killer at all. This is someone who killed for the act of killing, not for profit or organized crime purposes. So let's talk about the forensic question nobody asked. If the Axeman had been caught in 1919, what would the forensic evidence have shown? Well, first off, his height from blood spatter angles, his strength from the impact patterns on the skull and axe penetration, possible occupational backgrounds with calluses on his hands, for instance, possible surgical or medical background with the precision of cuts and the knowledge of where to strike. But did the police collect this evidence? Well, probably not professionally. Forensic science in 1919 wasn't close to what it is today. But it's a question worth asking. What did the actual crime scenes tell detectives that they chose to ignore in favor of Rosie Cortimiglia's narrative? Based on the actual forensic analysis, the real Axeman killer probably had these characteristics. Local knowledge of Italian grocers' neighborhoods. He had an occupational background involving tools such as carpentry, butcher, or labor worker. He's comfortable moving through homes in darkness. He's very patient, methodical, and not very impulsive. He targeted specific victims, so these weren't just random attacks. He's able to exert significant physical force, striking with enough impact to cause skull fractures. He possibly had medical knowledge, with the precise cuts and the knowledge of vulnerable points. And he was active during the periods of 1911, 1918, and 1919, possibly with lapses for prison or some type of relocation. So this profile doesn't match Joseph Mumphrey, who's a known extortionist and not known as a violent killer outside the one shooting. Frank and Orlando Jordano, who had no evidence, no motive, and the victim's own testimony exonerated them. Or organized crime, who had no profit motive, no message, or no pattern of business targeting. Here's who this profile might match. Unknown laborers or skilled trades in the community, possibly someone with prison history which would explain the gaps, or possibly someone who died or left the city in late 1919. The fact is the real killer is unknown. He's gone now. But for over 100 years, the investigation into his identity was derailed by focusing on a fictional narrative rather than actual evidence. Years later, I don't know exactly when, because the historical records are fuzzy here, but Rosie Cortimiglia admitted the truth. She lied. She was traumatized, she was grieving her daughter, she hated her neighbors, and when the opportunity arose, she named them as the murderers. She took it. She didn't think about the consequences, or maybe she did. Maybe she understood exactly what she was doing and just did it anyway. Either way, she finally recanted, but the damage was irreversible. Frank Jordano spent years in prison for a crime he didn't even commit. The woman he was engaged to, Josie Spera, she moved on. His insurance career was gone. The future he imagined had evaporated. And what happened to Frank after the exoneration? Sadly, the historical record doesn't tell us. We don't know if he stayed in Gretna or left. We don't know if he ever married. We don't know if he found any kind of peace. What we do know is an 18-year-old boy's life was destroyed by a false accusation rooted in trauma and xenophobia. His father, who had spent 45 years building a life in America, was imprisoned for a crime his own accuser later admitted he didn't commit. And the real killer was never found. This is the definition of injustice. Not just a crime, but the system's failure to find a criminal, and its success in destroying innocence. This case is over 100 years old now, but it's not a historical relic. It's a case study in how justice systems fail. It demonstrates this. 1. How trauma can drive false accusations. Rosie Cortimiglia most likely was not a bad person. She wasn't trying to just frame her innocent neighbors. She was a traumatized mother grieving her daughter, and that trauma made her susceptible to confirmation bias. 2, how xenophobia becomes systematic injustice. The Italian names were enough to make Frank and Orlando Jordano suspicious. The jury's baseline prejudice made the case. Rosie's testimony was just a match to their expectations, but the xenophobia was the fuel. 3, how investigations can be derailed by narrative convenience. It was narratively satisfying to solve the case, to convict the Jordanos, to finally move on. The harder work of the actual forensic investigation, following evidence rather than suspects, well, that was abandoned. And 4, how innocent people are exponentially damaged by false accusations almost as much as the actual crime victims. Obviously, the murders were horrific, but Frank Jordano never had a chance to live a life he imagined. The Jordano's family's reputation was destroyed. Meanwhile, the actual killer was never identified, never faced justice, and maybe never stopped. This pattern repeats constantly in criminal justice. We had the Central Park 5, the West Memphis 3, the countless exonerations from DNA evidence revealing that the innocent were in prison while the actual perpetrators were still free. The Frank Jordano case is just maybe the oldest, saddest example of a pattern that America keeps repeating. I opened this video by telling you a narrative that you most likely never heard before. We didn't just guess who the Axeman was. Most of you are already familiar with the story and already know it's never been solved. What we did instead was challenge a narrative that crime history has accepted as truth. We showed that talent was wrong. The foundational source for the Axeman history was based on barstool storytelling and not research. We showed that Mumphrey was most likely innocent, a person convicted circumstantially of a crime he probably didn't commit, based on the same kind of flawed evidence that convicted Frank Jordano. We showed that the untold victim of this story, of the Axeman story as a whole, is Frank Jordano. Not because his suffering is greater than the people actually killed by the Axeman, but because his suffering was preventable. It was a direct result of a failed justice system. We also showed that the real killer is unknown, and probably always will be. But we can say with near certainty that it was not Joseph Mumphrey, and definitely not Frank Jordano. So here's why this matters for how we consume true crime. We as people like solved cases. We like the closure. And we like knowing who the bad guy was. But our preference for narrative closure makes us credulous consumers of flawed evidence. We accept Talent's version because it's established. We accept Mumphrey as the killer because it wraps up the story. And we ignore Frank Jordano because his story is uncomfortable. Real investigation is messier, real justice is harder, and real history doesn't provide the satisfying resolutions we want. But if we're going to tell these stories, we have a responsibility to tell them accurately. Frank Jordano deserves that. His father deserves that. And the real killer, whoever he was, deserves to be remembered as an unknown rather than confused with someone innocent. There are dozens of cases like this in American history. Innocent people convicted, real killers set free, and false narratives accepted as truth. In many of these cases, the false narratives persist because the original sources were never fact-checked. If you're someone who loves true crime, who watches documentaries, and who reads true crime history, you have a responsibility. Fact-check the sources. Don't accept Talent because he's established. Don't accept any narrative because it's convenient. Push back on the solutions that seem too neat. Ask questions about the evidence. Notice when crime writers skip over the inconvenient parts. Frank Jordano, he's gone now. He never got his life back, and we can't change his story. But what we can do is we can tell it right. And maybe by telling the story right, we can create a model for how others tell stories more accurately. This is the real value of revisiting unsolved cases like the Axeman. Not to always solve them, but to be more honest about what we actually know and what we've gotten wrong.